Do you know how many women live their lives believing that the softer they are, the more they must bend to be loved? They imagine that endless giving will inspire devotion, that silence in the face of disrespect will keep the peace. Yet the paradox, one Carl Jung himself might recognize, is that it is not the absence of boundaries that holds a man's obsession, but their firm, unshakable presence. Men are drawn, often against their will, to the woman whose spirit they cannot easily trespass, to the one whose love flows freely yet is never cheaply earned. A feminine boundary is not merely a rule. It is a mirror. It reflects back to a man his own shadows, his unclaimed desires, his hidden fears of inadequacy. When you hold such a boundary, you do not need to explain it endlessly. Your very energy communicates it. And here lies the quiet cruelty and beauty of the dynamic. The more a man senses he cannot possess all of you, the more a primal urge awakens in him to try. This is not a game of withholding for the sake of power. It is the natural law of value, the way rarity stirs longing. The woman who knows herself is not afraid to disappoint, to say no, to walk away from what disturbs her peace. And each time she does, she is chiseling a place for herself in a man's mind, deeper and more unshakable than any superficial charm could ever reach. In Jungian terms, this is where the anima, the feminine image within the male psyche, becomes charged. When a man encounters a woman who refuses to collapse her standards to soothe his ego, she forces his inner world into confrontation. He sees, often unconsciously, that his validation will not be the currency that governs her. She will not bow to his moods. She will not silence her truth to preserve his comfort. The tension this creates is not unlike the tension of unfulfilled desire, maddening, magnetic, impossible to forget. And yet, this is where most women falter. Fear whispers that if they hold the line too firmly, he will leave. That is the illusion. A man may leave temporarily to soothe his pride, but the boundary lingers in his memory like a riddle unsolved. Days later, weeks later, he recalls the way she looked at him, not with malice, but with unshaken certainty, and wonders why her approval feels so necessary, why her absence feels like a hollow in his chest. Understand this, a boundary is not a wall against love, it is a channel through which only real love can flow. Without it, you invite erosion. Your spirit becomes the shore, worn down by tides that do not know when to retreat. With it, you create a rhythm, a push and pull that keeps the masculine alert, attentive, alive. This is the psychology of the chase in its most authentic form, not manipulation, but the natural response to scarcity and respect. To live without boundaries is to trade your crown for crumbs. To live with them is to walk in the quiet knowing that your worth is not negotiable. And here is where obsession begins, not in frantic messages or dramatic gestures, but in the silent replay of moments where he felt the weight of your standard and realized he could not lower it. Such a woman does not scream her conditions, she embodies them. She speaks little of what she will or will not accept because her actions, her silences, and her exits say it all. When she withdraws her attention, it is not to punish, it is because the exchange has lost its truth. This kind of absence is haunting, because it cannot be filled with distractions. A man feels it in the quiet moments, when no one is watching, and he wonders how to stand in her light again. And perhaps the most intoxicating part? She does not wait. She does not stall her life in the hope he will adjust. She keeps moving, keeps creating, keeps living as though the universe itself will send her what aligns. The man senses this. He senses that her world will spin with or without him, and this awakens a deep, almost primal urge to anchor himself within it. But she will not allow anchoring unless it matches the truth she lives by. It is here that masculine desire and feminine sovereignty collide, a meeting point that births both admiration and obsession. And once a man has felt it, he will measure other women against it, often without knowing. Because once a man has touched the energy of a woman who stands firm in herself, he knows the difference between hunger and fulfillment. And that knowing is what keeps him circling back, long after the moment has passed. There is a subtle cruelty in the way true feminine boundaries imprint themselves upon a man's mind. They are not loud, not reactive, not born from insecurity. They are delivered with the same calm as the sunrise, inevitable and unbothered by whether he approves. This quietness disarms him. It denies him the drama his ego feeds on, replacing it with something far more unsettling, reflection. He is forced to look at himself without the comforting haze of blame. In Jung's language, this is the moment the shadow stirs. The shadow is everything he has disowned within himself, his laziness, his entitlement, his unexamined hunger for dominance. When he meets a woman who refuses to play the role that justifies these traits, the shadow begins to surface. And with it comes both discomfort and desire. For the masculine, there is a strange allure in the woman who will not bend to his unpolished nature. It is as if her boundaries whisper, "You could be more than this." Most men do not admit how deeply they crave the structure that feminine boundaries provide. Without them, he drifts in his lower nature, unchecked and unchallenged. With them, he feels the call to rise. Yet the rising is not easy, and here lies the tension that makes her unforgettable. He does not only want her presence, he wants the man he becomes in her presence. You, as a woman, must understand the difference between a wall and a boundary. A wall keeps everything out, even love. A boundary, when rooted in self-worth, becomes an invitation, but only to those who can meet it. This is why the woman who walks away when respect is absent does not destroy connection, she refines it. She signals, without pleading, that her energy will not be a place where careless hands linger. There is a psychological mechanism at work here that is both ancient and unavoidable. Scarcity magnifies value. When a man senses that access to you is not guaranteed, when he realizes that your emotional openness is conditional on the depth of his character, he begins to view you as something rare. And rarity, in any domain, breeds obsession. But this is not about toying with him or staging absence as a tactic. That is manipulation, and men eventually see through it. The difference with real feminine boundaries is that they are not performed, they are lived. The woman with them is not pretending to be busy, she is busy, building a life that is rich with meaning beyond romance. She is not feigning disinterest, she is simply uninterested in anything that erodes her dignity. This reality hits him hardest when he tries to return after crossing a line. In his mind, there will be a replay of her absence, the moment the door closed, not with fury, but with finality. This replay haunts him because it carries no bitterness, only clarity. It tells him she is not waiting on the other side, counting the hours until his return. She has stepped into her own current, and it is moving forward without him. Here is the strange paradox: the more she honors herself, the more he begins to idealize her. Not in the shallow sense of infatuation, but in the deeper sense of perceiving her as a standard. She becomes the inner figure against which all others are measured, the one who would not yield. Even if he resists this truth, it clings to him. In quiet moments, he wonders what it would take to earn her trust again, what parts of himself would have to grow. And still, she does not turn to look back. This is the ultimate act of feminine sovereignty, the detachment that says, "You may join me if you evolve, but I will not pause my becoming for your delay." Such detachment is not coldness, it is the highest form of respect for herself. Men who have tasted it rarely forget. Because in the end, boundaries do not push love away, they refine it until only what is worthy remains. And the man who feels this knows, perhaps for the first time, that winning a woman's heart is not about breaking her guard, but about becoming the kind of man she would lower it for. There is a distinct shift in a man's psyche when he realizes a woman's boundaries are not negotiable. At first, he may test them, thinking that persistence or charm will soften her stance. But when each attempt meets the same quiet certainty, something deeper is activated, a recognition that she is not simply setting limits for him, she is living in alignment with herself. This is an entirely different reality than the one most men are accustomed to, where affection can be coaxed or bargained for. Jung understood that the human psyche is drawn toward what it cannot fully consume. When a man encounters a woman who remains whole unto herself, she becomes an archetype in his mind, not merely a person, but a symbol. She is the embodiment of the unclaimed, the mystery that resists possession. And in that resistance, his fascination grows. The more he tries to fully grasp her essence, the more he realizes there are parts of her he will never reach unless she invites him in. This is the beauty of true feminine boundaries, they create an interior world that is not open to all. A man may be granted glimpses, a moment of vulnerability, a glance that speaks of trust, but only in proportion to the safety and respect he provides. Anything less, and the door closes without ceremony. This unpredictability keeps his attention locked, because it stands in sharp contrast to the predictable patterns of women who compromise themselves to maintain connection. What he doesn't expect is how much these boundaries will challenge his own self-concept. They do not only protect her, they reflect his capacity for discipline, empathy, and emotional maturity. Every time she holds firm, he is faced with a choice: rise to meet her, or retreat into his familiar habits. And each time he retreats, her absence feels heavier. In the realm of attraction dynamics, this is the moment obsession quietly takes root. He begins to measure other women by the same unspoken standards she held. When they fall short, when they give too quickly, overlook too easily, or accept too little, he feels an almost involuntary comparison. Not because he wants every woman to be her, but because she has imprinted a new baseline in his mind. And here is where the feminine must be vigilant, to never drop those boundaries in the hope of keeping him. The moment they are abandoned, the very energy that drew him begins to dissolve. He may stay, but the dynamic shifts. Respect turns into convenience, and the psychological magnetism is gone. That is why the woman who is unwavering, who would rather walk alone than betray her own values, retains her power, whether he remains in her life or not. Men rarely admit the depth to which such women affect them. Pride forbids it. They may frame her as difficult or hard to read, but underneath, there is an unspoken respect that lingers. Even if he claims to have moved on, she becomes the silent benchmark for what he truly desires, even if he resists the work required to attain it. In Stoic terms, Marcus Aurelius spoke of the self as a citadel, a fortress not easily breached. Feminine boundaries are that fortress. They do not exist to shut the world out, but to ensure that what enters is worthy of staying. This is not arrogance, it is stewardship of the self. And for the man, standing before such a citadel, the desire to be granted entry becomes more than a want, it becomes a quest. Every quest, however, demands transformation. This is why the woman who keeps her boundaries intact is not just desired, but remembered. She is the rare one who does not simply inspire his pursuit, but requires his evolution. And once a man has been challenged in this way, he will not forget the woman who sparked it, no matter how much time passes, no matter who else he meets. There is an unspoken law in human attraction: we do not crave what is always available, we crave what must be earned. A man may not articulate this, but his behavior betrays it. The moment he senses that your affection is conditional, not on games or manipulation, but on the integrity of his actions, a subtle urgency awakens. He feels the weight of each choice he makes, knowing that every step either brings him closer to your trust or further from your reach. This urgency is magnified by something Jung understood well: the projection of the anima. The anima is the idealized feminine image within the male psyche, often dormant until triggered by a woman whose presence mirrors what he unconsciously longs for. But when this woman also possesses boundaries that prevent her from being consumed too easily, the projection intensifies. She becomes not just desirable, but sacred. The thought of losing her feels like losing a part of himself, not because she is his possession, but because she has awakened a dormant part of his soul. Yet the sacred is never desperate. The woman with strong boundaries knows that her role is not to prove her worth, but to reveal it naturally through the way she lives. She will not beg for understanding. She will not negotiate with disrespect. Her boundaries are woven into her being like the structure of bone, unseen at times, but impossible to remove without destroying her entirely. This is why men often mistake such women for being cold or hard to get. In truth, she is neither. She is deeply open to connection, but only under conditions that honor her. When those conditions are met, her warmth is undeniable, generous, radiant, disarming. But when they are not, she withdraws without hostility, simply returning her energy to where it is cherished. This lack of drama unsettles him, because it denies him the familiar patterns of conflict and reconciliation. Instead, it leaves a void, and in that void, he must face himself. It is in this silence, her absence, her refusal to chase, that his thoughts begin to loop. He replays their last interaction, searching for the point where the door began to close. He wonders how he might step back into her presence, and with each unanswered question, his fixation deepens. This is not the superficial obsession of infatuation, it is the more dangerous kind, the kind rooted in the memory of how her boundaries made him feel both challenged and alive. Over time, he begins to realize something unsettling: her boundaries were never about controlling him. They were about protecting her own spirit. And this realization shifts the dynamic entirely. What once felt like resistance now feels like an invitation to rise, to match her integrity, to earn his place not just in her life, but in her trust. The man who accepts this challenge changes. He becomes more intentional, more present, more disciplined. Not because she demanded it, but because she inspired it. And this transformation, once set in motion, binds him to her in ways he cannot fully explain. Even if they part, he carries the imprint of the man he became in her presence. And yet, the woman remains unbound. Her life continues in its own rhythm, untouched by whether he arrives or lingers at a distance. This is the paradox that fuels his obsession: she is both the source of his awakening and the reminder that his worthiness is not her responsibility to affirm. In the end, the men who encounter such women find themselves changed, whether they stay or go. For once a man has stood at the edge of a love defined by clear, unwavering boundaries, he will forever measure all other connections against it. And most will pale in comparison. A man never forgets the woman who taught him the difference between desire and access. Desire can be stirred easily, by beauty, charm, novelty. But access to the depths of a woman's heart, mind, and soul is something far rarer. It requires more than surface attraction, it demands consistency, respect, and the courage to meet her at the level she lives. When he meets a woman who will not lower her gates for anything less, she becomes the reference point for what real intimacy feels like. Jung would call her an individuated woman, one who has integrated her shadow, faced her fears, and no longer seeks validation in the approval of others. She does not need a man to complete her, and because of this, she becomes the kind of woman men most want to complete themselves beside. Her boundaries are not weapons but guardians, protecting the sanctity of her energy. And to cross into her inner world without meeting the requirements of those guardians is impossible. Men sense this, even if they cannot articulate it. They feel it in the way she listens without rushing to fill silences, in the way she declines an invitation without apology, in the way she looks directly at them without flinching or trying to please. There is a completeness in her that does not beg to be filled, and this completeness unsettles the unready man as much as it captivates the prepared one. Over time, the memory of her boundaries takes on a life of its own. Even when she is gone, her energy lingers, a quiet echo in his mind. Other women may offer more immediate affection, more availability, more compromise. But deep down, he feels the difference. Those connections might satisfy temporarily, but they do not challenge him, they do not pull him upward. The absence of challenge soon becomes the absence of meaning. And here is the irony: many men realize too late that her boundaries were not barriers but bridges. They were the path to a deeper, richer connection than anything he could find in an easy yes. By the time this understanding dawns, she may have moved on, not out of bitterness, but because her life's current carried her forward. She does not stay anchored to prove a point, she stays only where her soul can expand. In the eyes of the masculine psyche, such a woman becomes mythic. She is no longer just a person, but a story he tells himself, of the time he stood before something extraordinary and was invited to rise. Whether he rose or not becomes part of his self-narrative. And the unanswered question, what if he had done more, given more, been more, can haunt him for years. For the woman, this is the essence of feminine freedom, to know that her worth is not dependent on who stays or who goes. She can love deeply without losing herself, and she can walk away without closing her heart to the future. Her boundaries are not a reaction to past wounds, but a reflection of the wholeness she has cultivated within. And so, obsession is not born from playing hard to get, but from being impossible to diminish. It comes from the quiet, unshakable knowing that she belongs first to herself. The man who feels this knows instinctively that if he wants a place in her world, it will not be given lightly, and that is precisely what makes it worth pursuing. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.